Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for the fourth debate of term. The motion before the House tonight is this House would scrap tuition fees, and we have a number of different speakers from lots of different areas to discuss this tonight with you. In particular, because this is a topic that truly does affect everyone, hopefully, who is here, whether you're a current student, whether you're returning, all union members, it would be really great to hear your engagement from the floor. So whether you want to make a point of information during the speeches or you want to make a point in the floor round, please do, and I'll explain the format for that in a moment. So in terms of how we will run tonight's debate, we have 4 speakers per side, and they're going to speak in alternation. On this side of the House, we have side proposition supporting the motion, and then on this side of the House, we have side opposition. The way that this will work is after the first pair of speakers and before the final pair of speakers, there will be an opportunity for you to make points from the floor in proposition, opposition, but also in abstention of the motion. If you want to make a point in abstention, that can be a point of clarification, it can be a question that you may have, or just something that you feel that the speakers should address in the rest of the debate. Finally, if you do want to make a point during the speeches, you're very welcome to do so by standing up and saying, point of information on that point, or just making some sort of indication. It's entirely up to the speakers if they take your point. So if they carry on speaking or kind of indicate they don't want to, please do respect that, and there is an opportunity to make your point in the floor round. Otherwise, if they do say, then feel free to wait for a microphone, state your name and college for the record, and then make your point. Please try to make sure that points in the floor round and as a point of information are about 30 seconds or less. I think that is everything for now, so let's head straight to the debate. Speaking first in tonight's debate, we have Amate Doku. He is the former president of the Cambridge University Students' Union and the vice president for higher education at the National Union of Students. Amate, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. Good evening, everyone, and can I thank the Cambridge Union for extending this invitation to me to come and talk on this very topical issue. I should also probably say that I've come straight from Cardiff, where I've had the privilege of meeting representatives from the students' unions across Europe at a European Students' Convention run by the European Students' Union. And if you think they feel sorry for us over Brexit, you should have seen their faces when I explained how high our tuition fees are over here. So this evening, I'm going to make 3 very clear points why I think, and this is the view of the National Union of Students, that tuition fees should be scrapped and the whole post-16 funding system should be reformed urgently. Firstly, I'll make the case that the current system is unsustainable, even on its own terms. Secondly, that it is inherently unfair, and this is representative of a wider intergenerational inequality affecting young people. And finally, that we need to reimagine higher education as a public good and fund it accordingly. Now onto my first point, that the current funding system as it stands today is completely unsustainable. Now, the one thing you can credit this government for is consistency. And with tuition fees, as with many aspects of government policy at the moment, they have been consistently incompetent. Their detrimental policy was blown open at the last election, and it is clear that the youth turnout has made the government think again. Finally, last week, the government responded. Our interim Prime Minister announced that fees will be frozen at £9,250 and the repayment threshold raised to £25,000, signalling the end of a policy which would have seen fees rise to over £10,000 at an interest rate of about 6% by the time of the next election. Now, this policy was designed to save money and to save the state money, but it is failing to do what it set out to do in the first place on its own terms. It's not saving the taxpayer any money at all, and I'll give an example of how. Now, according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies, for each £1 loan to cover the cost of tuition and maintenance, what is known as the government subsidy is 43p. That's almost half. And we calculate that if fees were £500 higher in cash terms than they are, we estimate that the average loan subsidy would be about £18,000 per student, which means if you combine the cost of teaching and maintenance support, the total taxpayer contribution would come to about £25,000 per student, which is roughly what the IFS estimates the total contribution would have been before the tripling of fees in 2012. So clearly, this policy, the taxpayer contribution, is not going down, and as the government are trying to make you think under this new regime. In addition, the government has sold off the student loan book, a move which has been described as economic illiteracy and a bad deal for the taxpayer as well. Why? Well, since the majority of people do not pay back their loans, the government has to sell off the loan book for much less than it's worth. Private companies profit from these cheaper loans, and the government makes a quick buck in the short term for the detrimental long-term financial consequences. So I'm afraid it's simply not a credible position to think that the current system is financially viable. But it's also important to interrogate which taxpayers will be worst affected, and this leads very nicely onto my second point, that the current tuition fee regime is a prime example of intergenerational inequality. Now, we live in a country where we have huge inequalities, and you may have seen that earlier this week the government produced the race disparity audit, where they finally acknowledged that racism exists. So we'd like to congratulate them for doing that. But at a critical time in their lives, young graduates now face being in £50,000 worth of debt when they leave university, not having enough income to rent, let alone consider getting a foot on the housing ladder, and facing the prospects of never retiring. You can understand why young people are asking, how is it fair that they're set to be the first generation worse off than their parents? So it's absolutely astonishing when people make the argument that the fee system works because more people from disadvantaged backgrounds are going to university, without taking into account the fact that attainment on the whole tends to be lower for people from disadvantaged backgrounds, and they're more likely to drop out. You're essentially saying to young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who may complain about the current system, just be grateful that you're here. If we didn't have a system which puts you in £57,000 worth of debt, you wouldn't even be allowed to get a degree. So put up and shut up. No, thank you. But there is another injustice in the current system, which is actually more insidious and is wider than tuition fees. As many of you know, household and consumer debts are rising to record levels while wages stagnate. And whilst tuition fees, I will accept, are a very strange hybrid between a tax and a debt, I don't believe the government for a second when they say that they can guarantee to me now that fees will be, that the debts will be written off after 30 years. This government can't tell us what's going to happen in the next week, let alone the next 30 years. And they've already shown a willingness to retrospectively change the terms of the loans, behaving in a way which for any other lender would be deemed illegal and a contravention of consumer law. Now, with the repayment threshold as £25,000, at £25,000 now, as I said earlier, 81% of graduates will never pay back their loan. That, combined with a personal debt bubble, reveals a disastrous economic strategy pursued by this government, whilst they balance the books and grow the economy for short-term gain. Young people are right to question the inequality caused by fees and not take lectures, literally, from people who themselves had free education, because currently they will have to pay twice. Firstly, through repaying back their debts, and secondly, when this and other household debts rise to the point where the whole system will come down, crashing down, because of the government's economic complacency. And I can tell you, it is those people from more socially disadvantaged backgrounds and those people who didn't go to university who always fare the worst when there's an economic crash. So I've dealt with why the system is both unsustainable and unfair. But my final point is that higher education must be treated as a public good, and we need to have a funding system that matches that. Now, despite being the most interventionist Minister for Higher Education that we've seen in a generation, for Joe Johnson, higher education is a market, and students are their consumers. But I genuinely think this creeping marketisation of higher education is one of the most damaging approaches to take to the sector. Go on, I haven't made the point yet, but go on.
Just keep speaking, it's fine.
I can hear you, don't worry.
Because we are paying fees, do you not think it also puts universities in a position where they have to support students' views more, protect their rights as someone who is now sort of paying for a service?
So you mentioned two very interesting points in terms of protecting their rights and listening to students. I work for Cambridge University Students' Union. I can guarantee you they haven't been listening to us more under this fee regime than they have previously. So I'm afraid I don't take that point. So why do I argue that higher education is a public good? For a very simple reason, because an investment in an individual's education is and should be an investment in our society. And of course, we all benefit individually from our education, but we benefit more from everyone being given the opportunities to have an education too. It's an investment in more doctors, more scientists, more historians, more social workers, more teachers, as well as a worthwhile investment in the pursuit of knowledge as an aim in itself. But simply cutting tuition fees does not go far enough. And many people, I'm sure their opposition will make this point. To be honest, the easy thing to do would be to cut tuition fees and reintroduce a crude system of student number controls, harking back to how it was done in the past, which would obviously benefit the better off. But I would question why many of the people who make this argument have limited themselves to a binary grim choice between a system which doesn't work and a system which didn't work. In order to really have an education for the public good, we need to completely rebalance the entire education package of post-16 education. And that has to start off with parity of esteem between higher education and further education and apprenticeships, giving all young people real options when they leave school and options of equal value. That diversity of provision, which doesn't necessarily mean that there will be less students, would work out cheaper for the taxpayer in the long run. You'll have more people being paid to work as they study at the same time, less individuals burdened by debt, and more being able to spend more money, which would also grow the economy. And on top of that, we also need to be encouraging free lifelong learning. The skills gap, according to the Open University, is costing this country £2 billion a year, whilst we're paying out £3 billion in unemployment benefits. And that's even before Brexit has hit us. It is more important than ever before that educational institutions are incentivized not to treat students as cash cows, but to help the government with an overall strategy to plug this major skills gap that we have in this country, taking people out of dead-end jobs and giving everyone opportunities for educational growth throughout their lifetime.
On that point,
So, go on.
I'm delighted that you finally mentioned some numbers. I wonder if you could tell me, are the £2 billion and £3 billion that you've mentioned more or less than £11.5 billion it would take to scrap tuition fees?
No, but let me make this... So two things there. Firstly, in the point I made earlier, it's not actually as cheap as you think it is to fund the current system. And secondly, what I was talking about in this final point, which is a point that sometimes gets missed, I agree on our side, that it's not simply about cutting tuition fees, it's about reimagining the whole system so that there is parity of provision between further education and higher education, so that we encourage industry to get involved in education more, that we encourage different provisions of learning. And unfortunately, the current system doesn't incentivize that. The current system encourages universities to get as many students in, to treat them pretty much in the same way, and to get as money from them as possible. So the whole system needs to be reimagining, but it can't happen with the current tuition fee model. So for all those people who say that a fully funded education system with no financial barriers for students is outside the capabilities of this country, well, I say that you are talking down Britain, that we need to be imaginative and creative, as some of the rhetoric we've been hearing from those who are very keen to take us straight out of the, I'm afraid I'm about to sum up. But on a serious note, we live in a time when some of the major parties have failed to demonstrate that they are ready to tackle the challenges ahead. Climate change, automation, technological revolutions, globalizations, these call for new thinking, and accessible education, free at the point of delivery, must be front and center of those conversations. So reforming our post-16 education system is not just in our national interests, but is absolutely essential if we are to survive in an ever-changing and increasingly competitive globalized world. So to summarize the 3 points I've made today, the system is unsustainable on its own terms. It is deeply unfair to our generation, and most importantly, education at whatever stage of life is a public good, must be funded accordingly, and I beg you to support the scrapping of tuition fees. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Amite for his remarks and for opening the debate as a whole. Now to open for side opposition, we have Camilla Turner. Camilla is the education editor for The Telegraph, and her articles appear in the Sunday Times, The Guardian, the Financial Times, and the Daily Mail, amongst other places. Camilla, the floor is now yours.
Firstly, thank you very much for having me here. I'm a journalist, so when I'm at work, my job is to try and pitch stories to editors, and the first thing they ask is, what's new about this? Why do we care now? Hasn't this been going on for ages? And you could say the same about this motion. Tuition fees were introduced under a Labour government in 1998. Admittedly, it was only £1,000. It then went up to 3,000, and then in 2012, unluckily for probably all the students here, it went up to 9,000. But the principle of tuition fees, of student loans, of contributing to your own university education isn't anything new. But, as we know, in the general election this year, one of the Labour Party manifesto promises was to abolish tuition fees. And since Jeremy Corbyn was credited with winning over the youth and winning the hearts and the minds of the young people, it brought up the debate again. So let's look at some of the arguments that are used by the people who would scrap tuition fees. The first one, and perhaps the most powerful, the most gripping, and we heard it just now, the argument that it discourages poor people from applying, that it's a disaster for social mobility, that it widens the gap between rich and poor. But in fact, quite the opposite has happened. If we look at the actual figures, the numbers of people going to university, so the most recent set of figures from UCAS show that now almost a quarter of the poorest people in society are going to university, and that's compared to 13% a decade ago, and that's measured by people on free school meals. So clearly, tuition fees and the rise in tuition fees has not put people off going to university. Probably one of the least favourite aspects of my job is when there's a big data release by Department for Education or UCAS or Higher Education Funding Council, and I have to go through all the numbers and work out what the story is. Gives me a bit of a headache, but it is really useful for situations like now when actually there's no point having this debate without looking at the numbers and the statistics and the figures. There's no point just relying on ideology. It's unfair. It's, people shouldn't, it's intergenerational, but actually look at the numbers and the figures and you can see that those arguments aren't borne out. Yeah, sure.
Surely this is the first year, though, according to the data, that uni applications have fallen for a generation. Unfair might be an ideology.
So I think the reasons why university applications have fallen are quite multifaceted. A big drop was EU students, less of them applying to British universities because of Brexit. It doesn't entirely marry up to the advantaged argument because there's lots of different factors feeding into that, but thank you, good point. So the second argument that's used is that it's people's right to have a free education, and people should be entitled to free higher education, and it's an affront to make students pay for it ourselves. Previous generations never had to. Why should this generation, when it's unfair in so many other ways, why should they also have to pay for their university and pay a lot for it? Of course, everyone's entitled to their own beliefs, but I think this particular belief is not only misguided, it's also quite selfish. And this is because things are very different from what they were a generation ago. For when my parents or grandparents were going to university, it was only a very small proportion of society who were going on to higher education. So for the government to pay for it, without loans, for the government to pay for it up front, it was a very different situation to what it is now. So in Tony Blair's famous speech, the one where he said, education, 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 he also said in that speech that he wanted 50% of young people to go to university by 2010. Well, it's now 2017, but we're pretty much reaching that point. We have a third of 18-year-olds in the country going to university, and when you look at the number of people under 30 going to university, it rises to half the population. It's entirely different to expect the government to pay for half of the population to go to university. It's just not comparable to a generation ago when so few people were going. And why should the government, why should taxpayers be footing the bill for so many people to go to university? Especially when the people who are going to university are far more likely to get better jobs, have better earnings, better salaries, and a better life standard than those who aren't. You're effectively saying, can we have everyone in society, all the low-wage earners, all the unskilled jobs, can we have everyone to subsidize the people? Yep.
So when you say it will swap, when you say they will swap to the general taxpayer, tax importantly, are proportional to how much you earn, and they go up in proportion to earnings as you earn more. So it simply isn't true to say that really poor people who aren't even in a bracket to pay tax have to foot this bill. People who earn the most, who will be the people who got the most out of university, will in fact be the ones that pay it if it were to come out of general taxation.
Okay, so I mean, that is exactly how the student loans work. The more you earn, the more you pay back. It's proportional. But also, I mean, the way taxes work is everyone pays their taxes, and yes, rich people pay more than poor people, but everyone is still paying taxes, and it's up to the government to decide what to do with that money. Do they spend it on higher education, on early years, on the NHS? It's the same pot of money that the government are just distributing in different ways. And I'll just continue, sorry, is that all right? All right, fine, go on then.
You're saying that people pay more proportionally. It's quite the opposite way around. Well-off people actually pay less. They pay less in the interest rates they repay, and they repay it earlier. So it's the other way around.
So I think that's not right, because if you're talking about student loans, the repayment rate is RPI, which is currently 3% plus 3.1. So if you're on the highest earning brackets, if you're on £40,000, you pay 6.1% interest, which is far higher than those who are on lower earning brackets. So the more you, as a graduate, the more you earn, when you're on the top tax payment rate, you pay the 3.1% plus RPI. So the more you earn as a graduate, the more you pay back of your student loan every year. I'm going to move on. So when you're, continue on with this point, when you're paying back your student loan, you're paying back proportionally to your earnings. So once you've met the repayment threshold, just been raised to £25,000, you're then paying back more and more the more you earn. And then, if you haven't paid it back, yes, the government could change their mind, but currently the situation is that if you haven't paid it back after 30 years, it gets written off. So even if you go to university and you don't have the privilege, you're not reaping the benefits of the high earnings you've been promised, then you still don't suffer. You can still go to university and not be put off by potential low earnings later, because it will get written off eventually. So on this side, we're not saying that the current tuition fee and student loan system is absolutely perfect. We're not saying that there aren't things that could be tinkered with it. There's so many different aspects to it. There's the repayment threshold, the interest rate, the amount of tuition fees in the first place. There's so many different things that can be played around with. And as I said earlier, as more and more students are going to university, it has to be a setup that's fluid and kind of receptive to change. However, our fundamental point is that the setup of tuition fees and the student loan, that has to stay, because it's not fair to make the whole country contribute to something which only some people are reaping very large benefits out of. It's much more fair for people who go to university, and if they go on to have good jobs and have high earnings, it's much more fair for them to contribute more to the benefit that they've been entitled to. So, to sum up on my main points are that those who argue that tuition fees should be scrapped, a lot of their arguments are based on ideology and myths. And actually, when you look at the figures and the facts and the number of people going to university, the number of disadvantaged people going to university, it's just not true that they've been put off by the high fees. Actually, more, like half more, are going to university now than they were a decade ago. So none of that's borne out. Yeah? Yeah, that is true, and there are problems that students encounter at university. There are problems with dropout rates, and not everyone who goes to university goes on to a glittering career. But I'm addressing the very particular argument that is used for tuition fees, that poor people will be put off going to university in the first place, that they'll think, oh no, that's not for me, I don't want to have debt all my life, I don't have parents who can just cough up and pay off all my debt. That very argument that people are put off going to university, that's what I'm countering, and that's what I'm saying isn't the case, because they're not. More and more disadvantaged people, the free school meals measurement was used in the UCAS figures, they're not being put off, they are going to university in the first place. Is the tuition fee system as we currently have it perfect? Maybe not, maybe there's things the government can tinker with, but the fact that we have the tuition fees system in place, and it has been for since over a decade, that's what we're saying needs to stay in place, because it's the best system possible and the fairest system possible. Thank you, and I beg you all to oppose the motion.
Thank you very much to Camilla for opening slide opposition. And now it's going to be time for the floor round. There were some really good points made from the floor there. There are also some points that were declined. So if you do want to make a point, please indicate, and then please wait for a microphone so that you can state your name and college for the record. Firstly, in proposition of the motion, this House would scrap tuition fees. Do we have any points from the floor? I think we've got one just in the back there.
Keir Murison Emmanuel. I'd just like to point out, as much as people kind of talk about how tuition fees are a level playing field, not everybody has to take on that debt. Not everybody has to actually take tuition fees if their parents pay for it, which is a perfectly legitimate decision. But the problem that then creates is that people whose parents can't support them through university, either through tuition fees or maintenance, means they then have more debt that are saddled with, have to pay off more during their lifetime, and that means their income potential and their free income, which allows them to buy houses, which allows them to move around, and to they themselves increase their own wealth, basically reduces, and that just makes the cycle continue and continue. And I think the only way you can really stop that is to abolish them. And so that means no matter what background you come from, you're not saddled with any debt, and actually it's your earnings that determine whether or not you pay back through tax, which you'll know it's kind of done now, but again, there's still that divide between those students who get their parents to pay for tuition fees and the students who don't. So that is just my point. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that point. And do we have a point in opposition of the motion from upstairs or from downstairs? Yes, just there in the second row.
Navash Pratt-Jarvis, Downing College. I just wanted to say I thought it was a good point that the proposition made about an unfairness between generations, that older generations had to pay for fees, or didn't have to pay for fees, sorry, and that young people nowadays do. But surely if tuition fees were scrapped for the incoming set of students, then there would be a massive inequality there between two fairly similar groups of people age-wise, that somebody 5 years older than somebody else would have a massive student debt and somebody else wouldn't. So somebody who was younger. And therefore, the only real way I can see of getting around that is to then scrap all the, not only the student loans being taken on for people coming into university, but also all the loans that have been given out since the tuition fee system was introduced. And I don't think that's really economically viable.
Thank you very much for that point. And do we have any points in abstention of the motion? Anything you want to have clarified? I think we've got one upstairs on the balcony. Okay, that's okay. If you could just shout it out then, please. Thank you very much for that point there about whether we should look to other systems as well. Thank you for all 3 points. Hopefully the speakers in the rest of the debate can engage with what was said. And moving back to the main debate, the next speaker on side proposition is Lord Adonis. He is a British Labour politician who served as the Secretary of State for Transport from 2009 to 2010, and then served as an advisor at the Number 10 Policy Unit for specialising in educational policy. Lord Adonis, the floor is yours.
Madam President, I have to begin with a confession. I was the person who persuaded Tony Blair to go and create the system of tuition fees which you've all laboured under for many years in 2003-04. And I shall never forget doing a meeting in the 2005 general election, which wasn't great if you were a Labour politician in a university seats. Indeed, the Labour MP for Cambridge managed to lose her seat in Cambridge. I think she held me probably fairly personally responsible for losing. I'm glad to say that the good voters of Cambridge have now put it right. There's been vindication, almost posthumous. I think she's still alive, actually, but anyway, it came a while later. And Daniel tells me he has a majority of 12,000, so these things have all come right in the end, I'm glad to say. However, when I did a meeting on behalf of a candidate who was labouring under tuition fees in the 2005 election, I began by saying, I need to be completely frank with you. I'm the guy who is responsible. On my tombstone will be engraved the words tuition fees. And somebody shouted out from the back, not soon enough, they said. So it clearly isn't a great record to have had. And I would love to be able to come and tell you that I'd had some kind of Damascene conversion. That having been responsible for introducing these fees, I now saw the wreckage that they were inflicting on society, this huge unfairness between the generations, and it was now time to scrap that whole system that we'd introduced 15 years ago. And if I did so, it would earn me huge brownie points for the leader of my party, Jeremy Corbyn, with whom I agree on almost nothing else at the moment. So if I could go to him and say, Jeremy, I agree with you on tuition fees, you're right and I'm wrong, this would have been absolutely fantastic. And in particular, I have a massive disagreement with him on Europe, which is in fact, though this is quite a big issue, Europe is easily the biggest issue facing the country at the moment as we prepare to leave the European Union. Jeremy doesn't quite know what he thinks about the European Union because it's not a Latin American liberation movement, and he's trying to work out his view on it, whereas some of us have a very, very clear view that we should stay in the European Union. It is our destiny to do so. It will be horrendous for our trade and our international position if we wrench ourselves out of our main alliances and so on. So I'd love to be able to say that I'd had a great conversion. And I've also always wanted to quote those wonderful words of Walt Whitman. Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. Then people think I'm a much greater figure than I am, and because I'm capable of holding one set of opinions and then changing them completely and holding another. However, I'm afraid it's just much more humdrum than that. What has essentially happened is that a good idea that began now the best part of 20 years ago, which was that students should make a contribution to the cost of their university education to make it more sustainable, so we could have more going on to higher education, so that we could have better paid academics, though I never imagined that we'd be paying Vice-Chancellors quite as much as we do at the moment. And I'm having a debate with your Vice-Chancellor here as whether he really should be paid £365,000 as he addresses the problems of cuts in higher education. We take different views on this one. But that regime which we introduced, which was based on a philosophy which I think is defensible, we heard from the opposition that students make a return from their higher education, which I agree with, they do. You will make a huge return in terms of your earnings potential from going to university, and I would never advise somebody with decent A-levels not to go to university. But society also makes a big return from your degrees. It is a joint endeavour. We want teachers, we want doctors, we want people who work in local government, we want people who have higher skills. We need them. They give a big return to society. They give a big cash return. They pay a huge amount of additional taxation over the course of their lifetime, and they're the ones who pay the higher rates of taxation and so on. But we also need them for the social functions that they pursue. They also make a personal return, and as a rule of thumb, it seemed to me that the right way of going about this was roughly 50-50, that they should pay roughly half of the cost of their university education, and the state should pay roughly half of the other. And that was the basis on which we introduced the variable fees of £3,000 in 2004. The problem is that that principle, that I think was a defensible principle, has become completely invalidated and undermined by a Ponzi scheme that has developed since, that has added more and more obligations onto students with each reform and each passing year, and has turned what was a fair system of co-payments at the beginning into a deeply unfair system where students are now expected to pay the entire cost of their tuition. Please.
Are you arguing that fees should be scrapped altogether, or are you still maintaining your previous point that students should make a contribution, albeit a small contribution?
I'll deal it at the end with yeah. Yeah. I now believe, on the basis of the fact that it's proved not possible to maintain a stable system of co-payments, because frankly you can't trust the politicians not to seek to change the terms of trade, my view now is that we should scrap the existing system of tuition fees and we should put up the top rate of tax, which is almost entirely paid by graduates, and that is the way that we can then make good the funding shortfall for universities without being unfair between those of radically different income streams. The 40p tax rate, the 40p rate is only paid by 17% of those who work. Almost all of those are graduates, and those who aren't graduates almost certainly have children who are, and have a huge stake in the wider benefits of the graduate population. The reason why we didn't do it, interestingly, in 2004, because the first reform we toyed with was putting up the top rate. You'll remember that Gordon Brown increased the rate of national insurance in order to pay for the health service. We put that up across the income range, and we did toy with doing it for the 40p rate as well for funding universities. And the plan was that we would introduce a higher rate. We'd put it into a trust fund for universities, so that this would deal with the issue about there not being a reliable income stream for universities, but we wouldn't go through this rigmarole of creating debts, requiring students to pay it back, having to write off large amounts of debt, which we have at the moment, having to make very elaborate provision for those from lower income families and so on. The reason we didn't do it was because Tony Blair had fought 2 elections on not increasing tax rates at all, not increasing the basic rate, not increasing the higher rate, and of course he was averse to introducing a top rate too. He regarded his contract with the British people based on his experience of Labour politics in the 1980s, where it was very difficult to get elected on the basis of higher taxes because people thought you were going to be Michael Foot and would put them up to 80 or 90%. He regarded the contract as being one that didn't require and shouldn't require increases in taxation. However, if you put up the top rate, and we're no longer bound by those requirements that people imposed on themselves in the 80s and 90s, if you put up the top rate, as almost every other progressive country in the world has got a higher top rate than we have, a 40p, then you can square this circle of paying for higher education through the tax system, not having a massive debt burden on students, which at the moment is particularly throttling those in their 20s and 30s who are seeking to get on the housing ladder, seeking to establish families and so on. So you don't have that crippling debt burden, but you do also have a fair way of paying for universities, which is progressive and doesn't require those who aren't going to university to foot the bill for the proper contribution which those who do should be making through the tax system. And in answer to the question, so I was going to answer the previous question, and I'll take this one. In answer to the question from the gentleman who said, what happens elsewhere, it's very clear what happens elsewhere. The more equitable the society in which you live, the more progressive it is, the less likely it is to have tuition fees, and the more likely it is to have higher rates of higher taxation through which it pays for universities. And if you look at continental Europe, there is now no country in continental Europe, none, that has a full-blown tuition fees system, and the only ones that toyed with introducing it, and the only one that got that far in introducing it was Germany, which at the same time as we introduced our lower levels of fees did it. Every German land, every German state that introduced those fees in the years after 2004 has now scrapped them because the political and social backlash was so great. The only country in the world that has higher fees than we have is, guess where? The United States. The least equitable society of amongst advanced democracies, and where a massive social and cultural battle is taking place. And guess what? On the issue of fees, as to whether fees should be maintained, with Bernie Sanders and those who want a more progressive politics wanting to abolish the fees. And guess who is the main champion of fees and wants to keep them because they reinforce inequity through society? It's President Donald Trump. So if you want a fairer society, you want a fair distribution of the costs and benefits of higher education between those who go to university and those who don't. You don't want a Ponzi scheme that involves ever greater requirements being placed on students because the system becomes ever less affordable, as you have to have more exemptions and so on. It's becoming like the poll tax, which started out at a modest contribution and became huge. Then the right way of doing this, in my judgment, is not to have this highly complex, extremely inefficient and politically unsustainable system of fees, but to have a higher rate of taxation, which largely graduates will pay for, use that to fund your universities, and scrap this albatross of debts, loans, and massive repayments that students are having to make, which is progressively making the higher education system illegitimate in the eyes of rising generations, and will make it so difficult for people to cope with those other huge pressures that they face in their 20s and 30s, notably this ever-increasing challenge of being able to own a house and have somewhere decent to live. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Lord Adonis for continuing the side proposition. And now to return to the opposition, we have Lucas Michalonis. Lucas is a reporter for FoxNews.com and a writer who has been published in The Telegraph, by Breitbart and Spiked, amongst other news organisations. Lucas, the floor is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Brothers and sisters, and given the topic of our debate, perhaps I should say, dear comrades. Thank you, Cambridge Union, for inviting me, and I'm really humbled to be amongst such distinguished guests on both sides. I'm privileged to share my belief that our education system, as it stands today, lends opportunity to tens of thousands of young people to unleash their potential at some of the best educational institutions in the world. And that's the key point I want to put forward tonight. Tuition fees ensure quality education to the largest proportion of people. I understand that those wishing to see them scrapped have good intentions, I don't doubt that, but I question whether their proposal actually benefits young people, such as me. Now, to appease the libertarians and conservatives, that's what we have some of you here tonight, I can say tuition fees are great because the burden of educating yourself is put on your own shoulders. Meaning students take greater personal responsibility towards picking a degree that will benefit them in the long term. In fact, we're seeing the positive effects of this greater responsibility already. Today, more people than ever, except this year, according to the figures, more people than ever are generally going to STEM subjects, a field which we all know needs constant growth and invigoration. And if we really believe if someone really believes their media degree or any other degree, any soft subject, will prove useful in the future, they're more than welcome to do it because they're actually paying themselves for it. Sorry, no. Now, I'm not the one to claim that tuition fees are perfect. They're not entirely perfect. Some of the criticism we already heard tonight shouldn't be dismissed entirely. I believe mostly, but not entirely. But before we can talk about abolishing tuition fees, we need to understand what we will be putting in its place. This whole should judge the success of tuition fees by how the least advantaged in the society are benefiting, especially when compared to the system of free education. For this case, I will be talking a lot about Scottish case, education in Scotland. And maybe some of you will say, well, you're just picking a very convenient case. Why don't you talk about Germany, France, where we have little or actually no tuition fees? But I'm afraid that's a whole different debate, because we cannot really pretend that if we abolish tuition fees, we would have something radically different from what we have in Scotland. It's a good idea, as we heard the first speaker said, we could maybe have something radically different, but I just, given our political climate, don't think that's actually would happen. So let's start by looking at how tuition fees are helping the least advantaged in our society. For your working class people applying to university, said Jeremy Corbyn on a campaign trail in July, as with most things our absolute boy says, that is just simply not true. According to official UCAS figures, young students from disadvantaged backgrounds are more likely to go to university more than any year on record. 2016 marked the highest ever university admission rate for 18-year-olds, coming from the least privileged areas of England. And let's compare that to Scotland, where free education has meant that the rate of the least advantaged going to university is almost half of what is in England. Suddenly, this feel-good campaign slogan of free education doesn't feel so good anymore. English universities devoted more than a third of £1 billion to help the poor in 2010-2011, compared to only 10 million in Scotland. And I'm talking about access agreements. And for 2017-18, more than £800 million will be spent on attracting the least privileged students to be. This is just a 10% increase from just last year. Now, some of you might say, the fact that more underprivileged people are going to university is not necessarily a result of higher tuition fees. That's a fair point, of course. It's maybe the necessity, the idea that we have to have a degree in this job market is what's actually driving people to university. And that's a fair point, but I don't think that's actually an argument against tuition fees. As a matter of fact, that's the contrary is true. It is a system based on tuition fees that allows people to go to universities in large numbers. Not to apply and be rejected, but to actually go. And of course, we can talk about dropout rates. This is something really important. But the fact that people can apply and actually go to university, that's what matters. But if it's not, sorry now, I have lots of things to go over. It's not the case in Scotland, of course, where there have been just little to no increase in overall entry rates in the last 7 years. England and Wales, meanwhile, saw massive increases in people attending university since the introduction of tuition fees. It accelerated after 2012. And but most of a great deal of gains actually going to the least privileged people, as I mentioned before. Now, how has this happened? Well, while the architects on £9,000 tuition fees rescinded the cap on the number of people actually can go to university, unlike Scotland, where universities are still beholden to the government and its highly politicized budgets, resulting in no increase of a number of students entering Scottish universities. In fact, it's not just me talking about it. University Scotland, a group representing Scottish institutions, called upon the Scottish government to ramp up the investment in education, as no tuition fees policy actually put them on the brink of collapse in terms of reputation and status. Sure.
And so where does Scotland get its money from?
Well, they do raise taxation themselves as well. They have control over budgets, so they do have control over education budgets. Okay. So an important lesson from this is that fees actually liberate universities from government's whims and changes of direction. This is crucial to take into account if you believe education should be free and funded entirely by the government. Having no tuition fees make higher education dependable on politicians and who actually trust them. I appeal to die-hard socialists in this hall and ask, if tuition fees were abolished, would you trust the Conservative Party to maintain high enough spending on education to show high quality and accessible education? Or are you indulging in a fantasy where the Labour Party would find itself in a sustained position of power and keep education spending priority? You can answer that and vote accordingly. I'll leave you with this. The tuition fees in England and Wales are an untold success story. More than ever are the least privileged people going to university, and in larger numbers than ever. The success that cannot be mimicked in a system of free education. The proposition believes that the current system is unfair and should be repealed, but their replacement is the epitome of feel-good but do-harm politics, a reality that would most likely not be felt by themselves, but by the very people in the society they believe they are protecting. And the rest of my case.
Thank you very much, Lucas, for extending the debate with those remarks there. And now we're going to move back to the other side with Dr. Rebecca Montacute. Rebecca is a research fellow at the Sutton Trust, which works to improve social mobility in the UK. Rebecca.
I just need to start with a very quick clarifier, which is the views I'm giving tonight are my own rather than the Sutton Trust views itself, so blame me for any opinions that I may be about to say. So what I want to talk to you about tonight is the disadvantaged and disadvantaged students specifically. And I want to explain to you why, for them specifically, tuition fees and the current system is inherently unfair. And at the very least, even if you don't believe any of the rest of what my side have said, although I think they had very good speeches so far and I'm sure will be good to come, why, at the very least for them, this current system is not fair and should be scrapped. Before that, the first point I want to make is something of a clarification and an explainer on whether or not the current fees system has put off disadvantaged students from applying. Because we've already heard bits about this, specifically that there are the highest number of disadvantaged students at universities than ever before. And that's completely true, that is right. The numbers of disadvantaged students at university are now higher than they ever have been. But there are lots and lots of reasons, and as Camilla herself said, these things are incredibly complicated, and the reasons behind it are multifaceted. The biggest drive has been the fact that the attainment of that group has increased, so more of them have had the actual grades to be able to get into universities to start with, which is incredibly important. Another really important thing, which opposition side have brought up themselves, is the fact that since the higher fee threshold was put in place, every single university who's had the higher fees have had to explain how they're going to increase access for the poorest students. And they've put millions of pounds into widening participation programs. But despite that, the actual rate at which the number of disadvantaged students applying and getting into universities going up has barely changed really either way. So I think you can definitely say that the number of different factors which feed into why somebody makes that decision, we can at least say tuition fees haven't been disastrous. But considering how big the disparity is, especially in the top institution of disadvantaged students to start with, I'd say a continuation of the current rate is nowhere near good enough. And if it could have been even higher without those fees, then it should have been, right? That is what we should have had happen. And specifically, no thank you, if we look at, actually no, I will take you.
I don't know if this is on. So you mentioned that one of the many reasons why there's more disadvantaged people at universities today is because of the access agreements universities have to enter into if they want to charge more than £6,000. So where students are paying £9,000, universities have to make a big effort to help disadvantaged people get places. So, but doesn't that credit the current system that we have? It's because we have the current system of tuition fees that universities then forced to make more of an effort to allow disadvantaged people to get places.
Expect universities to be doing that anyway. I don't see why they have to get this amount of money in from the students to be able to persuade people that that is a reasonable thing for universities to do. Okay, so the other thing we had brought up on this point was Scotland and the fact that, well, Scotland's a good example for you to look at. Look how bad things are there for disadvantaged students. But this is ignoring a few important things about the Scottish context, because education policy there is devolved. The number of disadvantaged students who have high enough attainment to start with is lower than in England itself. And on top of that, they also have quite a large amount of higher education provided for by colleges rather than universities. The point is that it's not directly applicable. It's not the same, and you can't just compare like for like. And even if you could, right, there's the fact that you don't have to have both the static number of places that Scotland have had and no fees. You can increase the number of places, especially for the top universities, available through all of the means we've heard about previously, without having to actually have that cap. And they haven't explained to us why that wouldn't be possible, at least for the best universities, and at least to allow it to be free for disadvantaged students. Okay, so the point I want to talk to you now about is to have you all think about two very different students. And this is to talk about the way that their relationship to the system is incredibly different. So what you're asking someone to make the decision of when they're deciding whether or not to go to university is to have an extra 9% of tax on anything they make over £25,000 for the next 30 years. And that's quite a big decision for an 18-year-old to make. But really importantly, there's massive information asymmetry between the people who are the richest coming into the system and the poorest. Because those from the richest backgrounds will have already had probably their parents going to university, everyone in their community. It is known. They know what the likely outcome on that investment they're making is. They know the kinds of jobs they should be applying to and what kind of universities are likely to get them a big return. If we contrast this to someone who no one in their family, no one in their community has been previously, they don't have this level of information, right? But we're allowing them to make and expecting them to make the same choice on less information. But more importantly than that, but the reason why that information asymmetry is so important, is the fact that poorer students have worse outcomes when they do go. So you're expecting them to make this decision with less information when actually the system is tilted against them for a few reasons. As already brought up, poorer students are less likely to finish their degrees at all. If you're from a disadvantaged background, the dropout rate is about 8.8%. For their richer counterparts, it's 5%. For those people, you've had to pay the fees if you manage to get to Christmas with no returns. So you're now having to pay that 9% without actually getting any higher amount of earnings at all. But even if you do manage to go and you finish, poorer students are much more likely to go to a middle or low tariff university where the outcomes they actually get from their degrees aren't as good in terms of earnings and are often either less or similar, no thank you, or even less than they would have been from doing, say, an apprenticeship instead. But the important thing is that they often don't have access to this information. Then, even if they do manage to get to the same university to be able to get the same degree, poorer students are less likely to then actually get as good of a job when they come out of university for a myriad of reasons we don't fully understand. It could be networks, the ability to be able to get internships, but they are less likely to earn as much. So again, you're asking them to make the same wager on their future earnings with a less likelihood of return. And that difference is really important, right? Because if you're on the £28,000, say, and you have to pay 9% on that extra £3,000, that could very much, especially when you don't have savings available from your parents, be the difference between you getting on the housing ladder and not. And the important thing about this is it's 9% on any earnings over that. It's not like general income tax, where the amount that you pay increases into a larger proportion if you earn more. That is regressive and is unfair for those poorer students to have that additional burden at the exact time when they need that extra money. Then I come to the final disadvantage, which is even if that poorer student does go to a top university, does get a top degree, gets exactly the same job as their richer counterparts, and earns exactly the same, they will have to pay this tax for longer because of the fact that they had to take out larger debts to start with, because maintenance grants have been abolished, and now on average the poorest students owe £57,000 on graduation compared to £43,000 for the richest 30%. That is unfair. I just want to finish with one final thing, which is that whilst I have very much enjoyed this debate here tonight, and I hope all of you have as well, the very fact that we're having this debate, rather than talking about things like early years education for the most disadvantaged, is ridiculous. And the very fact we're having that is because all of us in this hall, almost entirely I would imagine, have had the benefit of university education and we become obsessive about it and obsessive about the difference it makes. Early years is considerably more important because the gap between the most and least advantaged has already opened by the time somebody starts school, where it just gets bigger from there. The only way you're ever going to really get the largest number of disadvantaged students getting to university is by fixing that place I beg you to propose.
Thank you very much, Dr. Montacute. And now to side opposition. Next up is Katie Balls. Katie is the Spectator's political correspondent and also a columnist at the I newspaper. Katie.
So it's a privilege to be here tonight in such historic surroundings, addressing students of the world's best university, and also, yeah, we'll go best. And also people who I know are capable of putting national interest ahead of self-interest. So, when I was asked to speak a few months ago, the circumstances were a little different than they are today. For one, it seemed that we had mainly begrudgingly come to accept tuition fees. And they looked like they were here to stay. Now, we have a party which looks like it would be the next party of government, if you believe polls, that wants to abolish them entirely. And we have a government that doesn't seem so sure they've commissioned a review. And across the room, I see 2 Labour grandees. And I am slightly disheartened that we haven't managed to summon one Tory MP to explain government policy. So not to seem ungrateful, I am happy to be here, but the prospect of speaking to you tonight has grown a little more intimidating. But that doesn't mean it's any less important. In fact, it's such a pivotal moment for tuition fees and for education university in general. I think there's never been a better time to make the progressive argument for tuition fees. And my general feeling here is that they are a better thing than a bad thing. I'm not saying the current system is perfect. I think that would be a bit of an unnecessary thing to go for. But I speak as someone who's paying off their debt at the moment. I hope it's halfway, but I try not to look. And it is something I could have actually avoided because I grew up in Scotland. I attended a comprehensive in Scotland, and I could have gone to university there, but I chose to go to an English university and pay fees. And I'm lucky to have had that choice, and I do get that. But personally, I think it was a decision that paid off because I have a job I enjoy and I earn above the national, average salary. So I personally think it's only fair that now I've got to this place, I only pay a chunk of my money is taken off my salary every month of the loan I took to get here and to speak to you tonight. If this argument applies to me, it probably applies to at least some people in the room, I hope. Because according to research by the Sutton Trust, the average Oxford graduate will make £1 million more over their lifetime than someone with no qualifications. Now, I would contend that it's not unreasonable to ask you to contribute something to the cost of the education, which is going to benefit you so much. And yes, I think it will benefit society too, but it's going to benefit you in a material way as well. Okay, you go.
So it's been proven that household income and your family background is a better determinant of earnings later on. So it's actually a masterstroke by Oxbridge not to admit people from widening participation backgrounds in the ways that they should do because they allow that £1 million premium that you're talking about.
Sure. Well, I'm going to go into explain why, even if you don't get that, I still think they're worth having. But thank you. Okay, so despite the lack of political players on my team, I do promise there are some politicians who agree with me, and I'm going to quote them. So, the price to scrap tuition fees is estimated at £11 billion. If you want to wipe off debt entirely, and that was mentioned earlier, we're looking at about a cool £60 billion. And if your aim is to reduce inequality, I would contend that it isn't the best plan of action. So at the last election, we had Ed Davey of the Liberal Democrats, once the party, probably a dirty word now, of abolishing tuition fees, and we know how that went for Jean Huppert in Cambridge. He explained why his party wasn't going to do this anymore. And he said he didn't think it was affordable, and actually restoring maintenance grants is the priority as it helps the most disadvantaged students if you're going to spend money on something. Now, we know the current Labour leadership and the Labour MP here tonight do support this, but there are some in the party who aren't so sure this is such a progressive measure. Say Phil Wilson, the Labour MP for Sedgefield. He recently wrote for the Fabian Society that the policy, his party's policy, is a middle-class offer to young people, on the whole from middle-class backgrounds. The irony is, he contends, I want to see working-class families have middle-class children. You achieve that by investing in education before they get to university and providing decent jobs once they've left, not by subsidizing middle-class kids so there is no money left to help those children who don't have the same start in life. I'm going to keep going just because, yeah, thanks. Now, the IFS, and they do also criticize the current system, as we've heard tonight, but they said abolishing this current system would benefit the highest earning graduates the most, with the lowest earning graduates benefiting very little. Right. There is no denying the current system has an image problem, particularly in recent months. It's got incredibly toxic. And I think you can see that by the fact that we can't even find an MP to talk about it. But if you look at it in a different way, I don't think it is as bad as being made out. So they turned into a monster, partly because the fees started at £1,000, and now they're at £9,250, and the government tell us that they're not going to go up anymore, so we should be relieved. Add to that an interest rate over inflation, and it just reeks of unfairness. But the problem of looking at the loan like this is it's not really like a personal loan in the conventional sense. It'd be more accurate to retitle it, rebrand it, and call it the Student Fees Contribution System. If a personal loan had the interest rate over 6%, it wouldn't sound like the best deal, but student loans are unlike that. First off, you only pay it back when you're earning a certain amount, usually, especially now it's been raised to 25K as a threshold, when your degree has led you to a job of suitable, a wage, it's led you somewhere, so you're beginning to get an investment off that. It works more like a graduate tax than a traditional personal debt, and what you pay back depends on what you earn. If you fall out of work, or even if you just feel like going traveling for a year, it just goes on pause. And I'm just going to keep going. Because I'm mid-sentence, okay. And personally, I found when I was between jobs, when I worked at the Telegraph, and then I moved to the Spectator, I had a few months when I was out of employment. And I found it very helpful and not stressful, knowing that I didn't have to worry about my loan suddenly building up, as it would in an original one. And actually, if all my loans were like this, my bank balance and credit rating would probably be better. I'm happy to take you on.
You're absolutely right to say that early years should happen before this. But once you have then that group of kids where that investment has happened, what do you then do for them when they want to go to university, especially considering that there is research to suggest people from lower income backgrounds at least report to say that they're put off by debt and the idea of debt to fund higher education? What do you do when that cohort's ready to go and then they have to suffer all of these problems?
Cool. I'm going to go into more in this anyway, so just bear with me and I will come to that. Okay, and also the best thing about this loan, I forgot to mention, is it disappears in 30 years if you haven't paid any of it back, which again would be good for all my other loans. Now, people would say, why have the loan? We had a point earlier where they mentioned other countries, and we're not just going to talk about Scotland, such as Germany, which quite recently decided to get rid of tuition fees. So tuition fees here were introduced to try and find a sustainable way to provide higher education to everyone who wanted to go. And since then, we have seen the number balloon. In Germany, it's still quite a bit lower than it is over here. So I think it's about 27% compared to 48%. So it is a lower burden. If we were to do it here, it's a much bigger burden, however you decide to pay for it. Also, I don't want to dwell on it too much because we've had a lot on it, but the stats do suggest that rather than fees putting off people from going to university, the numbers have risen in all the different, brackets. And it's been followed by more, not fewer students from lower income backgrounds going to university. Now, I personally think this is down to two things. First is that university education is still ultimately free at the point of use. It's not like in America where you have to secure your funding before you go. If you want to go, you can, so long as you can get into the university, so long as there are lots of places. And you only have to worry once you start earning again. And because universities are well-funded, they have lots of places to offer. And again, I'm not going to talk about Scotland too much, because we've had a lot, but do look to Scotland, because it is the closest system to our current system. And if you go there, then you will see that student numbers have effectively been rationed as a result. So you are seeing that the poorest have suffered. Now, the other argument is, should we pay for our privilege? For me, I think one of the most potent arguments is self-responsibility. So on average, a student pays 65% of their loan through fees, and a taxpayer shoulders about 35%, which is through teaching grants and loan subsidies. To shift that burden, it's either going to go to the taxpayer or borrowing. Now, borrowing, that will only increase the burden on future younger generations, so I don't see really how you're getting around what the current problem with the current system is. And we've heard about these alternatives, we've heard about this bold new system, but we don't really know exactly how it's going to work. And personally, I think unless you have the details, you can't really make such a drastic policy decision on a whim that things are going to be better. Also, if you look at Labour's manifesto when they promised to abolish fees, I think it was the highest costing pledge in that whole document. So it was more than was going to go to the NHS, it was much more that was going to reversing the Conservatives' benefit plans. And you've really got to ask yourself, is that what the money should be going on? Is that the big priority here? So as for the taxpayer, a university degree boosts lifetime income by £170,000 to £250,000 on average. So isn't it right that you pay something towards that qualification that is going to get you there? I don't really see what's progressive about expecting those who didn't attend university, who didn't make that choice, to subsidize the education of students who will go on to earn a degree that should lead them to a higher salary. I'm going to keep going. And yes, a degree is a positive contribution to society. I completely accept that. And I think that's a great thing. But everyone else who didn't go to university also makes a positive contribution to society. They all do their own bit as well. So I think it seems unfair to suggest that only we should subsidize people who made that choice. And if it turns out to be a really bad investment, if you go to university and you never really make much money, you're not going to have to pay much back of that loan at all. And the current system counters for that. Lots of people look at it and they point to the amount which won't be paid back as a flaw in the system. But actually, I think it's a good thing in the system because it's making sure that if it is a bad investment, you don't have to pay all that money. So, to conclude, abolishing tuition fees sounds kind-hearted and it sounds like a well-meaning gesture, and I know everyone who advocates it is well-meaning. But if you look closer, the facts just don't suggest this. To tackle inequality, don't look to easing the burden on tomorrow's high earners. Bring back maintenance grants. Look at early years education. Get there first before you think about higher education. It is time we had an educated discussion about the reality of fees, and it is time we worked out what can be reformed with the current system. But let's mend it rather than ending mass university participation.
Thank you very much to Katie for continuing for side opposition. Now it is your chance again to make a point from the floor. Again, it looked like there were lots of points trying to be made in those last couple of speeches, and we have one pair of speakers left to go, so if there's something you'd like them to address, please do raise it now. First of all, do we have any points in proposition of the motion? Anyone at all? Yeah, just over there.
Oliver Jones, Christ College. In the last speech, it was just mentioned about the fact that, obviously, after 30 years, a large amount of student debt will be written off. Now, admittedly, this may not be the case nowadays. I'm sure Lord Adonis would probably clarify this more. But I worked for a nuclear provider. Odd tangent, I know. But in fact, from what I learnt on my year out was the student loans company, certainly to begin with, was funded by a system, by the Nuclear Retirement Fund, which is effectively a pension that decommissions nuclear power stations. Now, if that money is all being loaned out and all that money is not coming back, as I said, very odd tangent, I know, surely we do not have, the government will then be losing money on infrastructure to decommission nuclear power plants, which is a very, very odd problem to have linked to tuition fees. So while, yes, personally, I absolutely love the fact that after 30 years, much of my debt will be written off, I'm slightly concerned of potential public health benefits if this is still the case, if the government can no longer afford this because they've given away that money.
Thank you. And now a point in opposition of the motion. Okay, lots of hands. We'd probably do more than one. I think we've got one upstairs. If you just want to shout from up there, please. we had quite a few hands in terms of points for the opposition, so I'll just take one more. Yes, just over there. And please remember to state your name and college, please.
I'm ill, but I'm not ill. I'm Henry and I'm from Hamilton College, but the illness is a side point. Essentially, I do not believe that tuition fees in themselves are unfair, but the tuition fees loan system is unfair. When we start banding around figures like £50,000 worth of debt, it does and it can put people off going to university. The reality is, this £50,000, you only pay back 9% above a certain amount of earnings. It's taken back by your employer through Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. It walks like a tax. It acts like a tax. Why don't we just call it a tax? And get rid of the entirety of the administration costs that come with adding ridiculous amounts of interest which people aren't going to pay back anyway. And just say, this is a tax. And we can use that tax to fund not only higher education, but also early years education and further education for people who don't go to university. Scrapping tuition fees is £11 billion we can't afford, but if we replace tuition fees with a system that is fairer and still results in people paying for their education, then surely that will leave the country in a better off place than scrapping them altogether.
Thank you very much. And finally, do we have any points in abstention of the motion, any questions that you still have before we close the debate? Yeah, right here.
I'm William from Queen's College. So I've just thought about talking about the Scottish problem. So with the Scottish problem, they've got a unique situation in that Scottish students don't pay tuition fees. But just over the border, there are lots of English students very keen to go to all these great Scottish universities who have £9,250 in their pocket ready to give to the Scottish universities. This is also a problem to think about when talking about Scottish universities.
Thank you very much for all of those points, and hopefully our final two speakers will address those as well. To close for side proposition, we have Daniel Zeichner. Daniel is the Labour MP for Cambridge and has been since 2015 and also served as the Shadow Transport Minister early this year. Daniel, to close the debate.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, can I say to those of you who are new to Cambridge, a very, very big welcome to one of the greatest cities in the world and the greatest universities. And to those of you who have been here a bit longer, I'm very sorry the general election interrupted some of your splendid revision exams during the summer. For those of you who found time to come out and vote, well done and thank you. For those of you who voted for me, a bigger thank you. For the rest of you, we'll see how we go the rest of the evening. But it's very good to be back here, and there's a kind of sense of déjà vu, I have to say. I've been in politics 20 years fighting general elections, and these issues have been batted backwards and forwards, and as Andrew rightly said, it was a very controversial issue in the early years of the Labour governments. A curious thing to be was actually to get all the various people who have spoken on these issues back in this room and see if we could all remember which positions we were taking at various times over the last 20 years. Because when you look at it, most people have occupied most ground at one time or another. And what that tells me, and I think the debate tonight has rather shown it, is it's not an easy issue, it's complicated, and there probably isn't a simple solution. But and it wasn't a popular position to take here at some times, actually rather agree with Andrew at the beginning of this debate, that 20 years ago, that we needed to have a contribution from individuals. But part of the reason for that was because of the extraordinarily poor situation we found universities were in the mid-1990s. Woefully underfunded, really struggling. And when you look at where we've got to since then, universities are now one of our great success stories. This is one of the greatest universities in the world. And it is one of our highest export earners. We are really, really good at this. But we have got ourselves into a mess on student funding. And it's always important to remember that the reason the universities are great isn't just about undergraduates, it's about research as well. And that's a separate issue, and there's some cross-subsidy here, which is complicated. But the reason I've begun to change my mind, and I have to say it came as a bit of a surprise to me when the Labour manifesto was published, like others, but the reason I've begun to change my mind is basically the system is broken. And that's what we haven't heard enough about tonight. The system is just unsustainable. It's not working. And it's costing the government more and more. And as you look ahead, it's going to cost more and more. In fact, we've actually reached the crossover point now where the government was doing better under the old system in terms of money it was getting in when people were paying 3,000 rather than 9,000. That tells you there is something unsustainable about the system. So it's got to change. And I think people on both sides of the debate tonight have acknowledged that there may be various permutations that you might look at on how you change it. But I just want to look at some of the options and also pick up some of the floor points. I mean, particularly in terms of it being broken, the first point about how the student loan company has operated. I mean, it is possible you could perhaps have set up this system and made it work. Well, it hasn't, has it? The student loans company has been a disgrace, the way it has operated, its levels of service, and of course it's become a financial instrument. Now, I don't understand the inner workings of the relationship with the nuclear industry pension fund, but I have to say the whole British economy at the moment in terms of Brexit seems like a bit of a Ponzi scheme, and I'm not so sure that we can look ahead 30 years and be confident that anything we say today is going to be working out that far ahead. So I can't reassure you on that. What I would say to you is I'd have a little bit more confidence about your ability to pay off your loan under the current system within the 30 years. I think there'll be some people in this room who can do it. For goodness sake, if people here can't do it, there's very little chance that anybody else is going to be able to, quite frankly. But that is part of the problem. So how would you do it? Because that's the point that you've got to be able to answer. If you're going to get rid of this system, what would you do instead? And who's going to contribute to it? Well, in the end, the individual possibly, but traditionally, of course, it's been the government through taxation. And I have to say, when Camilla was speaking, she'd say, oh, we can't possibly afford this. You know, the thing is, what if everybody went to university? Well, everybody goes to school. We don't say we can't afford to pay for schools. The thing is, we've got a dividing line at the moment at 18 where people go to university. I say that, but of course one of the other major failings of this system has been the disaster for mature students and part-time students. Completely fallen off a cliff. Now, probably most of us don't know many mature and part-time students, of course.
I think there's a massive difference between the government subsidising or funding entirely the education of children at school, because every child in the country needs to know how to read and write and have a basic knowledge in subjects by the time they leave school at the age of 18, and funding higher education, funding university. I don't think you can equate the two.
But you can, and I will come to that, so don't hold your breath. And indeed, if you were going to be spending this huge sum of money, would you spend it early on? Well, actually, you probably would. You probably would. I mean, there is an irony, isn't there, that we're sitting in a city where just today the Conservative County Council is trying to save £1 million on children's centres in this city, closing some of our children's centres. Now, I'd be putting the money into that. So who can pay? The individual can pay. You can pay through taxation. But taxation isn't just what you pay through your income tax. Taxation comes from business as well. And business benefits from education. Now, I'm not one of those people who thinks that education and university is just there to provide people with jobs and future prosperity for businesses, but it's a key element, and particularly in our changed system of higher education, where it is not the same as it was 30, 40 years ago. The new universities are providing many more skills for business. So there is a case for saying that business should be contributing. And I would say it's a particular case for business to be contributing when we have seen since 2010 a dramatic decline in the contribution that business makes to the economy. I think you may be beginning to see where I'm leading to with this argument in a moment. And I certainly would be the first to say that it's the skills issue which is the real challenge for our country. It really is, and there's actually some cross-party consensus on that. Now, the question of fairness and whether it is better or worse for pulling people from disadvantaged backgrounds into the system, we've heard some of the discussions around that. A huge effort has been made by universities like the University of Cambridge in terms of widening participation. And I think, like Rebecca, feel that you can do that. You don't have to have a tuition fee system to be doing that. Begs the question where you would get the money from if you're not. But that's where I come, in a way, to my concluding point, which is that the offer that Labour was making at the general election was a transformational offer. It wasn't just a simple, are we going to get rid of tuition fees or not? It was a national education service. It was about education from those very early years, right the way through for everybody, for everybody. And the bit, of course, that I'm afraid our good people in the media don't always understand, is that we were talking about a huge contribution into further education as well, into skills. It wasn't just about universities. Now you can argue, is there enough money in this economy to make any of this possible? Of course it's a legitimate discussion to have. But it has all been framed, I'm afraid, with a narrow economic account set by the current government and the previous coalition government, that basically whose narrative was, Britain's broke, so you can't afford public services anymore. Of course.
Sorry, you mentioned, you know, the tremendous debt. All of you have mentioned across this the debt it puts on students, and then you have also mentioned how it's a priority for people from disadvantaged backgrounds to go to university. Would you consider that maybe more people would go to university from disadvantaged backgrounds, even more people, if people in the Labour Party especially didn't go on telly all the time telling people it's saddling them with a large amount of debt?
Well, a very good diversionary tactic to try and blame the messenger for this. No, the debt is real, for goodness sake. I have, no good shaking your head. I employ someone in my office, a young 21-year-old who joined me a few weeks ago with a £50,000 debt, and we sit at lunchtime and calculate how much her debt will go up this month, because even though she's paying it off, the interest charge is so high on it, it will be rising and rising and rising. So don't underestimate the effect that that level of debt has on many, many people. It's not the Labour Party talking about it that creates the debt. It's the debt that creates the debt. Now, let me come to a conclusion. What we're trying to offer is something completely transformational and different, like we did after the Second World War, when the welfare state was created in the first place, like the National Health Service, a national education service for everybody, of which, of course, university education will be a key part for some people, but parity of esteem, so the people who get left behind. And one of the most telling things for me in Andrew's work and career was when he wrote a book called Education, Education, Education. I wasn't always a fan of yours, Andrew, I have to admit. But when you gave that account of the school in Nottingham, where you asked the question, has anyone in this school ever been to the university just up the road? And the answer was nobody ever has. I tell you, that could be repeated in Cambridge today. There are people in schools in Cambridge, there will be schools who have had nobody who comes to this university. So the task of transforming our country to give those people opportunity is huge. Labour's offer was not just about tuition fees. Tuition fees was part of the package. Getting rid of the tuition fees is a way of... Absolutely, yep.
Is that actually Labour's position? Because when interviewed before the election, they suggested it would be. When interviewed afterwards, they said it definitely wouldn't be. So could you clarify Labour's position?
Well, what I can clarify is Labour's position rather than Joe Johnson's gloss on Labour's position. I have to say the Conservatives are beginning to learn about politics. What you do is you attribute something else to what the party is saying. I think what you're referring to is student debt rather than tuition fees. And what the Conservatives have done is they've built an entire argument on one answer that Jeremy Corbyn gave in an interview. I gently suggest that if every utterance of Boris Johnson was turned into a manifesto pledge for the Conservatives, they would very quickly move away from this type of politics. We quite acknowledge, and it goes back to the point raised earlier about the generational unfairness. There is a problem, of course, if we scrap tuition fees now for the preceding generation. And what we do want to do is do what we can to ameliorate that. But I don't think continuing unfairness is necessarily the way to deal with an unfairness. And we have said that we will look at how we can help. Now, we've not said that we can conjure up £36 billion or whatever it costs to do that. So I think it's, and if you look in the manifesto, it's absolutely clear we do not say that. So you're right. All that's happened since is the Conservatives have played some clever politics. So let me just finally finish, because I'm beginning to run out of time. That's the offer from Labour. Scrapping tuition fees is part of it. It is a huge change. We are living in a fantastic time of opportunity. Technological transformation, if we just got rid of Brexit, we could actually be doing it even much more effectively, obviously. But it's a fantastic time. Getting rid of tuition fees is a part of it. What I'd exhort you all to do is to make sure you vote, because the older generation does vote. They vote in their interest. It's in your interest. very much your interest and the rest of the country to get rid of this skewed system and create something much, much better, which we can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for the closing for side proposition. Now to close the debate as a whole, we have Tom Harwood. Tom is a former chair of the student wing of Vote Leave and former presidential candidate for the National Union of Students. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm very honoured to be speaking before everyone today. It's a nice surprise to get the invitation, but I'm really, really proud to be speaking for the motion that this side of the House is arguing for this evening. Actually, it's great to be at a debate where there are two sides, because it means even if I come second, I'll be doing a lot better than I did in the NUS presidential election, which is always a bonus. But that's probably enough about the NUS, because it's time to focus on substantive issues that actually matters to students. Thanks, guys. Tonight I'm going to discuss why this debate would be very, very different, and indeed was very, very different 6 or 7 years ago. I'm going to discuss why fees work well, why the evidence is overwhelmingly with this side of the House. I'm going to talk about how the proposition has tonight focused on peripheral issues, has tried to obfuscate their line, has tried to talk about other issues other than the actual fact that we'll be voting on this evening, which is simply tuition fees. And I'm going to lay out what this motion means. But first, just a tiny bit of rebuttal. Daniel's like, no, you were talking about how business tax is going to save us all, right? That was the Labour manifesto's point, that you're going to whack up business rates and that's going to pay for the £11.5 billion it would take to get rid of tuition fees. Well, at a time that we are leaving the EU, and at a time that France will be lowering its business tax, when America will be lowering its business tax, what will happen to business in this country if we say we're going to charge you a hell of a lot more to operate in our country at a time when we're exiting a market? But beyond that, I'd like to get to my actual argument. Sorry, you can have a second. Go on then.
The draconian levels of taxation which Labour was suggesting, I don't know whether you can remember perhaps who was the Prime Minister when we had those draconian levels of taxation?
Sure, it was Margaret Thatcher.
And David Cameron, actually.
Well, both. Well, David Cameron lowered it, and as a result of lowering business tax, actually receipts went up, but that's a whole other story. In December 2010, a little-known Labour backbench MP from Islington North went on a television station that the Shadow Cabinet is really rather fond of these days. It's called Russia Today. He went on that station in December 2010 to talk about new proposals for tuition fees. He laid out 4 reasons why these proposals were terrible. He said it would mean fewer and fewer people going to university. He said it would mean end of access to education for people on low incomes. He said it would mean universities would become the preserve of the wealthy elite. And he said it would mean enormous damage would be done to the international standing of our universities. But he wasn't alone. In fact, the hard left of the Labour Party said much the same thing. The NUS said much the same thing. Left-wing pressure groups said much the same thing. But why am I bringing this up? Why mention 7 years old television interviews, 7 years old arguments, 6 years old arguments? Because they're not saying that now. And why aren't they saying it now? Because it's turned out to be wrong. The arguments of the Labour Party from that time have turned out to be wrong. And more than that, the exact opposite has happened in each of those cases. Far from fewer and fewer people going to university, more and more people are going to university. Entry rates for 18-year-olds are at an all-time high. More people are going to university than ever before. More poorer students are at university than ever before. The rate of increase for disadvantaged students is higher than the rate of increase for advantaged students. The biggest gains have been among ethnic minorities. Now, black students are twice as likely than in 2010 to attend the top institutions of this country. Go for it.
They're also 26% less likely to get a first or a 2-1. Should they get a discount?
Absolutely. Progress has been made, but not enough progress has been made. It's not perfect today. Clearly, it's not perfect today. There probably wouldn't be a debate if we lived in a world, we wouldn't need to have a union in this city if we lived in a world of peace and harmony and clouds and puppies and rainbows and unicorns. The fact of the matter is that we live in an imperfect world, but things are improving. And I hope that you'll agree with me that it's a good thing that gaps are closing, that more and more people are having opportunities. And yes, of course, we're nowhere near where we'd like to be as a society, but it's getting better. Not right now, not right now. What I did want to mention is that the only part of the country where the largest increase of acceptances into university is among the well-off, is Scotland. But we have talked a lot about Scotland this evening, so I'll probably leave the rest of it now. So Corbyn is right in a part that, a part of the UK is becoming more of a preserve of the elite, but that is the part that doesn't have tuition fees. In 2018, this is the final point he raised, the point about the international standing of our universities, which is one of the reasons that tuition fees were, of course, brought in the first place, to compete in a global marketplace, and it is a global marketplace. Well, the Times Higher Education World Ranking, it put 2 British universities in the top 2 places in the world. I won't say which one came first, because it might offend some people in this room. But the substantive point here, and someone mentioned international comparisons earlier in this debate, the substantive point is none of the top 10 universities in the world provide free tuition to their domestic citizens. None of the top 20 do, none of the top 25 do, none of the top 30 do. In fact, you have to get to number 34 before you find an institution in that rank that offers free tuition. And there's a reason. Because charging tuition fees, having that slight extra 9% on PAYE for graduates, means that universities can get the funding they need to deliver for students. But the proposition are making different arguments to 2010, because the facts are now remarkably on our side of the house. It's really quite interesting that this opposition have talked about, the proposition rather, have talked about system overhaul. They've talked about early years education. They've talked about maintenance loans. Practically the only thing they haven't talked about is tuition fees, which I expect is what we all turned up to hear about today. But if the facts are so clear, why is this even an issue? Why is this so hot button? Why are we still discussing it? I think it's down to a failure to communicate. I mean, there were abject failures in the first few years of coalition government where people were easily rode over with the terms debt, with the idea that we're burdened, when actually it's not a debt at all. It's only paid over 21 and soon to be £25,000 when you're earning, which is going to be above the average wage. You will only be paying back a debt when you're earning more than the average person earns in this country. I think that's quite a salient point to remember. But more than that, it comes out of PAYE. It's wiped off in 30 years, and graduates are simply taxed 29% as opposed to 20%. But moving that to one side, lots on the left agreed with this system until it became convenient for them to oppose it. We saw a note published on the NUS website in 2010 calling the new system relatively progressive. That note was swiftly deleted and an uproar ensued. Angela Rayner allegedly pushed for this policy not to be in the Labour Party manifesto. She was advocating early years as something that would be a more timely, a more progressive policy to pursue for £11.5 billion. Andy Burnham this year at Labour Party conference says that Labour needs to move away from the current policy it has on tuition fees because it's regressive. The proposition has made an emotional case tonight. It sounds nice, but under inspection it just falls apart. It's telling that opposition parties usually oppose tuition fees, and when they're in government, they usually introduce or up them. I mean, Labour Party opposed fees and then introduced them. The Conservatives opposed fees when they were introduced and then trebled them. And the Lib Dems, I don't even need to go there. But there's a pattern. And that pattern is simply because the evidence is overwhelming. And it might sound at first unenviable to be a student and to come here and advocate this case on this side of the house. But as I said, I couldn't be happier to do so. because this system is providing the greatest gains for the most disadvantaged in our society. And that's a wonderful thing, and we shouldn't shy away from it, and we shouldn't ignore it. And yes, there are problems. Of course there are problems. Under any system there are problems. But my God, are those problems getting smaller day by day? This debate, at the end of the day, is about tuition fees. If this debate was about maintenance or early years, I might very well cross the House and speak for you guys' side, because living costs are clearly the biggest issue that students face today. Housing is clearly a huge issue that was mentioned earlier. But if you focused your impressive energies on fighting for those things rather than wasting time tonight talking about a system that's actually delivering for students, maybe we'd see some of the advances that we need in terms of access and in terms of attainment for disadvantaged people in our society. It's frustrating to be ignoring evidence. It's frustrating to listen to zealotry rather than fact. 7 years ago, the proposition provided a very different argument to the one that we're hearing today. The more that time goes on, the more facts vindicate this side of the House. The Labour election pledge was simply headline grabbing. 11.5 billion pounds could have reversed all of the welfare cuts. All of the welfare cuts from the last Parliament could have been reversed with that amount of money, but it was a political choice not to do so. And it was a political choice that played off very well in terms of silly political games, but it's not one that will help the most disadvantaged people in our society. And so I'll just end by asking that this House consider our priorities. Voting for this side of the House this evening is not endorsing this government. It's not agreeing to this government's policy on living costs or interest rates or, bizarrely, housing, as was mentioned earlier. Those things are not tied to what we're voting on tonight. All our argument is that the current funding system enables universities to stay at the top of the table and opens them up to the most disadvantaged. Voting for the opposition means that you believe that the best way to spend £11.5 billion is not on those most advantaged graduates, but is in other areas, is in helping other people, probably the people that need the most help. The proposition's case is expensive, it's unfair, and it does nothing to solve the real issues in higher education. Please, tonight, side with the evidence and not the ideologues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and indeed thank you to all our speakers tonight. Thank you also if you made a point from the floor and for being here to join in the debate. A quick reminder that tomorrow afternoon we have the philosopher Will MacAskill speaking, and then this Saturday is the Freshers' Ball. But to go straight to the vote tonight, as ever at the Union, voting is by your feet. If you'd like to vote in favour of the motion, this House would scrap tuition fees, please walk out at the right-hand door marked Ayes. If you'd like to vote in opposition of the motion, please walk out the left-hand door marked Noes, and if an abstention of the motion, please walk through the centre door. Thank you very much.